Hey, Sea People, it's Dave here from my basement. For a while, I have been thinking about like what it would be like to do a theology class or something at Seed because I love theology. So I was talking to the other leadership guys, and we're like, well, with our world going crazy, this coronavirus out there, and all of us in quarantine and social distancing and all that, what if I maybe just did some short kind of videos, just introducing different theological concepts as just the start of a conversation? So do a little video here, post it. Maybe you guys want to comment on it, write something on it, or post your own video about experiences about different theological ideas. And that's totally cool. Let's all do that. I think it'd be fun. Um, let's see what happens and see how this goes. We'll do an experiment here. If I say anything heretical, I think Malin is ready to burn me at the stake. So, let's dive on in here and talk about some theology. So, theology, obviously, theos, Greek word for God, ology, the study of God. And as we dive into this, I realize that a lot of you at Seed, some of you are new Christians. Some of you have newly maybe reconnected with your Christian faith. Others of you have been Christians for a very long time. And so some of these ideas that I'm about to talk about with theology, maybe is stuff that you've heard before. Other people, maybe it'll be brand new. It's kind of hard to talk about something like this. We're going to talk about God and the theology of God a little bit in a short video and kind of hit people where they're at. But hopefully I'll throw some stuff in here that might be interesting to those of you who have been Christians for a while and those of you who are new to your faith. And by the way, we're all growing and developing with theology, with the Bible. You never really arrive. We're always learning. We're always growing. God is always teaching us stuff. So no shame if you don't know something. There's a lot that I don't know. And studying theology, that's the one thing that keeps ringing true to me, how much that I don't know studying this topic. So anyways, back to theology, the study of God. If any of you have ever taken a journalism class, they teach you in journalism, there's 5 ways to ask a question that is hard for someone or impossible for them to give you a yes or no answer. Like the who, what, why, how, when questions. People can't answer those yes and no. They have to give you a little bit more detail. So in theology, we can ask those same questions when we're approaching the topic of God. Who is God? What is God like? What are his characteristics? How do we know God, or how do we know what God is like? And that question is in philosophy what they call epistemology, which basically is a fancy word which means how do you know what you know? If you're sitting at a bar with a guy and this guy says, I know that Lee Harvey Oswald was not the only shooter in the John F. Kennedy assassination, your first question is going to be, well, how do you know that? What's your information? Like, what's your source? How do you know that is true? And so when we're talking about God, if you're talking to somebody who doesn't believe in God or is an agnostic, and you say, I know God, I believe in God, I have this conviction that God exists, they may ask you, well, how do you know that? What's your basis for that? What's your information? So how do we know God? How do we know what God is like? And then another question, why is God important or vital? Why is this such a big time thing? So those are the questions that people may ask in theology when talking about God. And here's the thing, like when we talk about theology, some of you may not be into theology, and that is totally fine. Everybody has different hobbies, different interests. Some of you love painting, comedy, sports, you name it. Everybody has different hobbies. And so to be into theology and to read all these books, that isn't what makes you a great Christian. Christianity is about loving Jesus and wanting to follow Jesus. It's not necessarily a hobby of digging into a bunch of dead people's books or reading these big doorstop type books. So you don't have to do that to be a good Christian. I want to say that right off the front. But at the same time, we all are theologians, because anybody who thinks about God or has thoughts about God or beliefs about God is making theological statements or is believing in something related to theology. Even an author here, this is the late Christopher Hitchens, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. a staunch atheist. But he is doing theology, even though he may deny it. When you say God does not exist, that is still a theological statement. When you're saying that Christianity is bad for people, that is also a theological statement. Not just Christianity, religion in general. And, we're sad that Christopher Hitchens died. That was about 10 years ago now of cancer. He's a great writer. Disagree with him, but definitely a very great writer. But everybody does theology. So with Christians, our foundation for what we believe is the Bible. This is the ESV version. Not necessarily the ESV version, but just in general, the Bible. This is how we know who God is, what God is like, why belief in God is so important. This book does not contain all that God is, because we'll get into this. God is infinite and eternal, so God is bigger than this book. But we believe God inspired this book with truth about who he is and his encounters with people throughout time. So this book tells us a lot about God. And obviously, in that is theological. What does this book tell us about God? It's impossible to do that in a short video, but we'll get a few highlights in here. Genesis chapter 1, the most famous verse one of the most famous verses in all of Scripture. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So, God existed before this world and universe were brought into existence, and that's a huge statement. God is eternal. He's infinite. He is separate from creation in that sense. He is uncreated. We live in a creation. He created us. He is the author of this creation. And that's a part of who God is. So God was over the earth in Genesis, forming and shaping everything. The Spirit of God was over the waters. Spirit, by the way, in Hebrew, ruah is the word, and it's a feminine article. The ruah of God was forming and shaping the earth and shaping creation. So God is the creator. He is the author. And there's so much that Genesis 1 tells us about God. Right around the time that many scholars believe the Old Testament was written, which maybe was 700 or 800 BC, it may have been back further than that. There certainly was oral tradition that went back a lot further than 700 or 800 BC. But the Israelites were writing down Scripture. If it was during that time, it was during the Babylonian exile. And so other cultures, as you might imagine, had these creation stories, these creation myths. One of the most famous ones that we've dug up, I guess as far as we know, it's just what archaeologists happen to find, but it's Enuma Elish, and it's a Babylonian creation myth from Mesopotamia. And in this myth, real quick, just to highlight it, there's this young kind of up-and-coming god named Marduk, and he's like this champion of this group of gods, and he comes out of the ranks and he fights this goddess named Tiamat. And he takes Tiamat and he breaks Tiamat's body in half. And with one half of her body, he forms the heavens. With the other half of her body, he forms the earth. This is literally in Enuma Elish, this Babylonian creation myth. And so, when the Israelites were being inspired to write Scripture by God, there's a lot of scholars, evangelical scholars, who believe that the Israelites were writing to kind of correct the record. They were hearing these other myths and they were saying, no, that is not how this is. That is not who God is. Here is who God is. And they write Genesis 1. And you notice with Enuma Elish, there's this war, there's this violence, there's these gods fighting each other. But in Genesis 1, there is one God. And he creates the world in this 6-day succession, right? In Genesis 1. And he creates the sun and the moon. And he creates people. And he creates animals. And after each day, he says, it is good. There's peace. There's harmony. There's joy. There's not war and violence. There's this harmony and joy to creation. That also tells us a little bit about who God is. What are some other scriptures that talk about who God is? Let's read some really quick. Psalm 102, there's lots of good stuff about who God is in the Psalms and people's relationship to him. Psalm 102, 25 to 27. Of old, you, meaning God, laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain. They will wear out like a garment. You will change them like a robe, and they will pass away. Heaven and earth will pass away. God will always be there. He's eternal, and he's infinite. Psalm 90. verses 2 to 4. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever, you had formed the earth and the world. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. We have no conception of that as people, right? Because we had a beginning. We had a beginning point, and then we go on into eternity. But God is from everlasting to everlasting. Another famous verse, Isaiah 46. As you know, with these creation myths back then, cultures were polytheistic. They believed in many, many gods, but the Israelites had a message for the world. Isaiah 46, 9 and 10, actually 8 through 10. Remember this and stand firm. Recall it to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things of old. For I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish my purpose. God has existed forever, and he is the only God. He's saying monotheism, coming out of Israel. So what are the characteristics of God? There's a great book, a couple great books here. I'll recommend books because these are people a lot smarter than me. The Knowledge of the Holy by A.W. Tozer. This goes through different attributes of God and who God is. There are non-communicable attributes of God, such as what we've been talking about, that God is infinite and eternal. Those are things that we as people are not. Like God is separate in those categories. Those are non-communicable attributes of God. But there are also communicable attributes of God. That God is wise. Well, human beings can be wise. Maybe it's rare, but we can be. Human beings can show grace and mercy. God is gracious and merciful. We can see human beings being gracious and merciful in our world. Again, maybe it's rare, but you can see it. God is just. People can be just. We can make just decisions here. God is spirit. There's a bunch of Bible verses that talk about God being spirit. And human beings are spirits. So there's non-communicable attributes of God because he existed forever and he's eternal. But he created man and woman in his image. So there are attributes of God that we share because we're made in his image, per Genesis. So read A.W. Tozer's book. This is also another classic, Knowing God by J.I. Packer. All information about knowing who God is, the Christian God that we believe in. Let's keep doing these book recommendations because these people, again, are a lot smarter than me. Here's another one I read last year. This is not a Christian believer. Karen Armstrong, though, is a first-rate scholar. And she writes here about Judaism, Christianity, Islam, a history of God. It's kind of the development of the idea of God, what different people have believed throughout time about God. Again, there's a lot in there that we disagree with, but if you want kind of a survey of history about belief in God, that's a really great book that I read last year. Read it along with Scripture to be discerning, but a great book nonetheless. If you're looking for apologetic arguments, this is a good place to start. Our pal Tim Keller, Reason for God. You can check this out with apologetics. So with theology, it's important that we don't stay up in the ivory tower. Like, if we just talk about these ideas, we can just, rearrange intellectual furniture in our head all day. If there's no connection to our lives, to our personal lives, then it's really incomplete. It's an incomplete process. So what does believing in this God mean for us as Christian believers? We live in a scary time. People are really concerned, rightfully so, out there. On Facebook, I'm starting to see friends of mine post that they know people who have passed away from the COVID-19 coronavirus that is impacting our world right now. It's terrible. It's horrible. And unfortunately, unless we have a miracle, which we all should pray for, there's probably more to come. As we're going through this, realize that something that we have in common with God is that God feels things too. God grieves. God is sad. God is with us in feeling these emotions. As Christians, sometimes I feel like we have this pressure that we have to do this Jesus sale pitch. So we have to act like everything is okay, or put fake smiles on, or do whatever else. And everything's not okay. And if you feel these things with me, it's understandable. And God feels these things too. Jesus wept is a famous verse in the Bible, right? The shortest one. He cried over his friend Lazarus who died, even though he was going to raise him from the dead. There's sadness, there's grief. And it's okay to feel that. It's okay to go into that. But the thing that believing in God also gives us is a hope. It's a hope because God is beyond this world and we can trust him and we can look to him. But he's not just beyond this world as in up there somewhere. He's also involved in this world and he's involved in our lives. And that's the kind of hope that can make a difference in this very uncertain time that we live in. We don't know what's going to happen. People on TV don't know what's going to happen. But we can trust in God as the one who does know what will happen. Anyway, thank you for listening to this. We'll see if it helps out. I invite you, again, to think of this as a starter of the conversation. If you want to add thoughts about God that have really struck you, you can comment. You can post your own video. If you've had experiences with God that you want to share, you can post your own video. You can write. Would love to hear them. So anyway, thanks for listening. Thanks for going to the end of this. Appreciate it.